Good morning, dear Intriguer, and welcome to Intrigue Outloud. On today's show, I'm joined by Intrigue co-founder John Fowler to discuss protests in Bangladesh and the grinding war in Ukraine. It's all coming up. Hey there, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right, thanks, Ethan. The cold weather has finally come to Chicago at the end of October, so sitting here in a big sweater.
Cold weather, and we're approaching Hallows Eve. So I won't ask you what you wore as a costume. I doubt you want to talk about that. And you know, we're intrigued. We're not supposed to be backwards looking, so we'll look ahead to tonight. What kind of candy can we expect you to be eating over there?
Be a couple of Kit Kats, I think, and then I mean I can't stand this thing that you guys eat, this candied corn stuff.
Oh, that's
ridiculous.
No,
it's like a toothbreaker, isn't it?
I absolutely agree with that. Now, people that defend candied corn, defending the indefensible,
lunatics,
frankly, yeah.
They are. I must say before we get started that Chicago has, as a city, each and every one of its residents really deeply commits to Halloween. The UPS drivers were walking around in masks with the car was covered in cobwebs. I don't know if that was from poor maintenance or whether it's Halloween, but either way, it's working for them.
Well, for a city that dyes an entire river green to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, I would expect nothing less.
Expect nothing less, exactly.
We talked last week about Pakistan's upcoming general election. We've talked plenty about India's election next year. By the way, Baby Ruth for me, favorite candy. But there's
apologies, I didn't ask.
There's another South Asian country, Bangladesh, that we sometimes I think we sometimes leave them out. But they also have a major election coming up in January.
Yeah, and I think the reason we're talking about them so early before January, you mentioned the election's not until January, is because there's been near round-the-clock opposition rallies in the Bangladeshi capital, Dhaka, to protest the country's longtime Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina. But before we get into all of that, let's zoom out a bit and kind of interrogate that question of why we don't talk about them maybe as much as we talk about their big neighbors. It's sometimes easy to forget that Bangladesh is the eighth largest or eighth most populous country in the world, 170 odd million people. And for reference, Russia has about 145 million residents. So, Bangladesh is right up there.
In a much bigger land area.
Exactly. Bangladesh is tiny. But, of course, one of the reasons I think we don't talk about Bangladesh is unlike its neighbor and unlike Russia, it doesn't have nuclear weapons. So it kind of slips off the radar a little bit. But on top of having a lot of people, Bangladesh is also the third largest Muslim majority country in the world. It's South Asia's second largest economy, and the third largest military. So there's really no good reason why we shouldn't be paying a lot more attention to Bangladesh, I don't think. So with that said, as you mentioned, the election is coming up in January, and these protests around the country are getting pretty serious. In fact, I think on Sunday, police actually said that those protests turned pretty violent. A police officer was brutally killed by a mob. Hundreds and hundreds of people were injured, and thousands more were arrested. And that includes the Secretary General of the opposition Bangladesh Nationalist Party. He was ordered to be sent to prison on vandalism charges, I believe.
Wow. Okay, so I want to ask why these protests started, why they turned so violent. But first, who is Sheikh Hasina, the prime minister? Yeah,
she's a fascinating character. And again, one that we probably ought to know more about. So she's the daughter of Bangladesh's founder, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who was the first president of Bangladesh after it declared independence from Pakistan back in 1971. So it's still a relatively new country in global terms. So Hasina has been in power, or she was in power first from 96 to 2001. And then she returned to office in 2009, and she's been in power ever since then. She's actually the longest serving female head of state in history, which is an interesting fact. But throughout her really long career, she's had kind of one primary antagonist, a nemesis, if you will. and her name is Khaleda Zia. She led the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party from 91 to 96, and then again from 2001 to 2006. Though, interestingly, the two women actually worked together to oust Bangladesh's military dictator in 1990 before they kind of became rivals after restoring the country's democracy. Also, you will have noticed that Bangladesh has actually been led by women for all but 2 of the last 32 years, which is kind of crazy, right? So since 1990 to 2003, all but 2 years has been one of those 2 women leading the country. But anyway, the early partnership, as I mentioned, between Zia and Hasina has now turned really, really bitter. They're really fierce rivals. And I think the Prime Minister Hasina's critics say she's now pretty much totally focused on her own political survival and making sure Zia doesn't return to power much more than she is in good governance or anything like that.
Yeah, we've all got a nemesis like that. But John, that's a pretty serious accusation for critics to be making. What's their evidence?
Yeah, it is serious, but I think it's not without merit. Zia got caught up in a corruption investigation in 2018 that many international kind of watchdog groups and actually the US State Department as well said was politically motivated from Hasina. It ended with a 17-year prison sentence for Zia and a ban on all of her political activities. Hasina's government also recently sentenced Zia's son to prison in absentia for charges that date back to 2007. He'd actually taken over from his mother as the chairperson of the opposition party after she was sentenced to prison. So going after the son as well. I think to critics and outside observers, it's kind of part and parcel of what Sheikh Hasina has been doing as prime minister the last few years. They say she's kind of downgraded Bangladesh's democracy, brought the judiciary under her thumb, undermined freedom of press. We know the drill on how this stuff goes by now.
Typical stuff. So that must be what they're protesting, the degradation of democracy and whatnot.
Well, yeah, obviously. I think that has kind of built up over a few years and is spilling out now. But I think the protesters have a sort of an immediate concern, a flashpoint, if you will. And that's what we kicked off this conversation with. It's the upcoming election, right? The current disagreement that they're having, one of many, I suppose, but it's down to this big question around who should actually run or, administer the election in January. The current Prime Minister Hasina and her party, they say that in keeping with the Constitution, they should be in charge of managing the process. Opposition leaders say that Hasina should at least temporarily step down and let a caretaker government administer the election to make sure that it's free and fair and unbiased. And I think they probably have pretty fair reason to worry that it won't be. In the last election that her party did administer, that was back in 2018. There were huge reports of vote rigging, and opposition was pretty badly suppressed. I think, in fact, Zia's party ended up boycotting the election because they just felt like they couldn't get a fair go at it. And Hasina obviously ended up winning something like 75% of the vote in that last election.
Any reason to think the opposition will get their wish here, that that the political process will be more open this time around? Well,
we like to try and find silver linings and be optimistic where we can, Ethan, but so often I give you the same answer and say I'm not overly optimistic that that'll happen. If we bring it back to the present, Prime Minister Hasina's party organized a counter protest in Dhaka yesterday. So they don't look like they're kind of ready to give up power too easily. They're countering the protest rather than kind of working with the concerns, right? I don't think the idea of having a caretaker government to administer the elections is a crazy one. Bangladesh has done that before. But the problem is when they've done it, those governments that are put in place to manage the election process have consistently gone further than they were supposed to. They've outlasted their mandate. And so that's a very convenient and reasonable argument that the current prime minister says, that's why we shouldn't do it. Look, I think if you have to sum up this kind of situation at this stage in their careers, people like Hasina, lifelong political animals, huge heavyweights in the political scene in their countries. They know where all the bodies are buried. They have a lot of bodies that they don't want to be dug up themselves. So it becomes an act of survival. It's more about being terrified of losing power, because then the same state machinery that you've used to subjugate your enemies, to put down the opposition, to prevent them from getting power, that gets weaponized and used against you by your opponents. So, losing power really often becomes life or death. So, with those stakes, I think the next couple of months potentially are shaping up to be pretty ugly in Bangladesh.
To the libel lawyers that are listening to this from Bangladesh, John did not mean literal bodies being hidden.
All metaphorical.
Today's episode is sponsored by Millennium Space Systems. Millennium Space Systems, a Boeing company, is a small satellite prime delivering high-performance constellation solutions for the national security space. Founded in 2001, the company's active production lines and 80% vertical integration enable the rapid delivery of small satellites across missions and orbits. Check out the show notes to learn more. All right, welcome back. So we've obviously spent the last few weeks talking about the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, which, by the way, John, just as an aside, it looks to have turned into a ground invasion as we predicted on Friday. That's a different story, but there's, of course, another war going on in a nearby neighborhood. So what's the latest from Ukraine?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important that we remember what's going on in Ukraine, despite the fact that, something horrible is unfolding in the Mideast at the same time.
Despite the fact that there's just so much going on all over the world.
All over the world. And it's a real full-time job paying attention to it, but that's why we're here, Ethan. We do that for our listeners and our readers, don't we? Anyway, so I do think it is important to remember about Ukraine. Really forgetting about Ukraine would be a best-case scenario for Putin. It's one that he's trying to manipulate, to cultivate folks forgetting about what's going on in Ukraine and focusing exclusively in the Middle East. And as it escalates and spirals, Western resources will start to turn away from Ukraine, or this is Putin's hope, of course, and that global attention will turn away from the war, and leaders from the global south will start identifying new reasons for the high food and fuel prices that I think has largely kept the pressure on Putin to now. So, it's in his interest for folks to have other scapegoats and other things to focus on. But I do think attention before the Middle East crisis broke out, three and a bit weeks ago, attention was starting to turn away from Ukraine a little bit, perhaps because of their less than stellar performance in the counteroffensive over the summer. I'm not sure, but I think that's true to say.
Yeah, I mean, can you put that into perspective? How much less than stellar are we talking? Has Ukraine's, this long anticipated counteroffensive that we spent weeks preparing for and talking about? I mean, how much has it gone according to plan?
No, it hasn't. And what we're talking about when we say sort of less than stellar is that there's been barely any sort of territorial changes along the front line. There's been a few here and there, but nothing major. A handful of towns have been captured, but nothing of major strategic significance, I think it's fair to say. I think Ukrainian commanders and intelligence officials always said that it wasn't going to be easy. They tried to tamp down expectations, right from the start, I think. They said it was going to be, take longer than Ukraine's supporters in the West and the media wanted it to take. And they also point out that I think that their goal wasn't just to take back land, right? It's not just about a game of Risk on a board game. They're trying to destroy Russian assets. They're trying to take out tanks, artillery units, and headquarters even. And all of that is fair and true, but I think it is also fair and true to say that Russia has been a very formidable defender. Certainly, they have improved and learned lessons when you compare it to the early, maybe 12 months of the war. Interestingly, I was reading something the other day where defense analysts were describing how Russia is now defending the territory that they have using a tactic called elastic offense, where they kind of retreat to a second line of positions, encourage Ukrainian troops to advance, and then they attack them as those soldiers move in to attack them. I think it's still obviously clearly a defensive maneuver, and you don't get a lot of wars where a country invades another country and then employs such openly defensive tactics as if they were, defending their own lands, their own capitals. So even though I think it's fair to say the offensive wasn't as successful as many people had hoped in the Ukrainian camps, it doesn't necessarily mean that Russia's kicking goals either. It just means that things are kind of grinding along, right? But if we switch from those border towns in Ukraine to the kind of Crimean front that's down in the south, and it's mostly a naval battlefront. Ukraine has had some successes there along the Black Sea. We've seen some of the Western supplied weapons that Ukraine has taken on over the summer. They've kind of brought places like Sevastopol and big portions of Russia's Black Sea naval fleet into range for Ukraine. Listeners might have read of the attacks on the Russian naval HQ in Crimea a month or so ago. There's been various commando raids throughout Crimea over the summer. So that has been successful, and it's important because it helps keep the Black Sea free-ish and open-ish for the civilian cargo ships that carry the grain from Ukraine from the port of Odessa along the west edge of the Black Sea and out through the Bosphorus near Turkey. So, we've got this kind of almost two different parts of the war. We've got the land war, which I think, as I say, is mostly stalled out, but the Crimean front, which is a little more positive for Ukraine.
So, back to the land piece. What does fighting look like right now? Is it the same sort of grinding attritional warfare that we have become accustomed to?
In short, yes. But there have been some developments over the last couple of weeks. While we've all been watching the events unfold in Israel and Gaza, a battle has been going on in the eastern Ukrainian town of Avdiivka. Despite not making the front pages, perhaps because it's harder to pronounce, but Bakhmut and Mariupol are now common knowledge in most folks' lexicons.
Yeah, these are not easy names to pronounce to begin with, but we learned them
exactly
quickly.
But because they were on the front pages every day, right? And now they're not, or this particular battle hasn't been. But it is quickly turning into one of the biggest battles of the year, or of the war even, I would say. And it is actually reminiscent of the Battle of Bakhmut, which happened earlier this year. Not to get too deep into the gory details, Ukraine says it's killing up to 1,000 Russian soldiers every day. And according to British intelligence, it could be Russia's deadliest battle this year. Again, I hate getting into the numbers because they're just impossible to verify. But I think we can pretty safely say that just an extraordinary number of soldiers are dying on both sides each day. And we don't know on the Ukrainian side because, of course, Ukraine doesn't publish its own casualty statistics. But where this battle differs from, say, the battle for Bakhmut, like I mentioned, Avdiivka is known as the gateway to the Donetsk province. And it actually is a fairly strategically important city in the east of Ukraine. So the brutality of the fighting there is perhaps less symbolic than some of the other fights that we've seen over the last 6 to 12 months. Plus, I think timing is a real big issue here too. Both sides know the front lines will probably freeze, figuratively and literally, when winter comes very, very, very shortly to that part of the world. So they're probably both looking to score one propaganda, one actual victory before that happens. But as I said before, and like the battle for Bakhmut, these grinding urban battles over fairly small towns, and they're not big cities like we saw in the opening parts of the war. They are pretty small rural towns, right? They're just indicative of just how brutal and attritional this whole war has become, and how few major, headline grabbing breakthroughs I think we can expect going forward.
Yeah, that sounds right. Are these the early signs of a stalemate, of a permanent stalemate?
Well, I think yes. I think the fighting would probably suggest that we're in a stalemate right now. But we have to be careful to distinguish that a stalemate doesn't necessarily mean either side is preparing to give up. It just means they're fighting and not winning either way. Ukraine is still asking for and still receiving new weapon systems from Western supporters. Ukrainian pilots are currently training using their F-16s that they've been given, and they think that can turn the tide of the war. So they're still looking for those breakthroughs. And as for Russia, I think their biggest bet strategically has always been to wait Ukraine out, to hope that support dies off, wanes over time. And we've certainly seen some signs, as I said before, that might be right. We've got attention-grabbing things happening elsewhere. And of course, we'll get a big piece of that puzzle revealed to us after the presidential elections in the US next year, about whether the US stays such a staunch supporter of Ukraine as it has been so far. I think we mentioned at the top, and I've said it a few times, multiple crises kind of draw attention away from Ukraine, and that only helps Russia's war effort. And I think we wrote in the newsletter a couple of weeks ago, I think this is why US President Joe Biden has been so clearly been trying to link the two conflicts, the Israeli conflict and the Ukrainian conflict, link those in the minds of the Americans. The idea that so if you are fighting on principle, you're fighting in both of those places so that Ukraine doesn't get left behind. As for peace talks, I think I saw that there are some peace talks happening in Malta at the moment between 65 countries without Russia, I should note. But realistically, Ethan, I think there's no appetite to negotiate an end to the war on either side, anytime soon.
Well, thanks, John. Appreciate the update.
Thanks, Ethan.
And that's going to do it for me. By the way, if you love Intrigue Out Loud, and if you're listening, I imagine you do, please make sure to leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, really wherever you listen to your podcasts. In the meantime, I'm Ethan Plotkin. See you on Friday.